Tucker Carlson is not pro-Palestine. Tucker Carlson is not out here being like, I'm with the resistance, right? I'm here and I believe the Palestinians deserve full liberation, a right of return, and this and that. He's not out here saying that. His is more of this kind of anti-Israel, like the United States overextending itself. Also, some of that concern is coming from this realist position, kind of like a Mearsheimer position, which is that, hey, instead of focusing and wasting our resources here, we need to be watching out for Chinese expansionism. We need to be focusing on fighting our real enemies instead of giving all our money and attention and power, et cetera, to Israel to go kill babies and whatnot.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh, here with my co-host Mohammed, and we're joined for this episode by Saeed. We discuss what it means to be a journalist and how journalists of various political stripes responded to the genocide in Gaza. Senna is herself an award-winning journalist, having previously served as a correspondent and a producer at Al Jazeera. She's currently writing on Substack, and you can find her there using the handle @SennaSaeed. Before the conversation with her begins, a quick thank you to our supporters, without whom this episode would not be possible. If you're new to the show and you like what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. Find us at proteanview.org. You can also subscribe to Muftah magazine at muftah.org for free to receive our newsletter and updates about the podcast and more. To help us keep the show running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. Give us a like, rate us, and share this episode widely with your friends. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Saeed. Senna, thank you for joining us. Can we get started with a question about your entry into journalism? When did it begin and what got you into journalism in the first place?
So I was interested in journalism from a very, very young age. You know, growing up, especially in my household, like I would watch 2020 Fridays with my dad and my mom. And it was just like such a mainstay of an experience as a child. And I feel like, especially if you're growing, a lot of Pakistani households in particular, like, are never apolitical. I've never heard of an apolitical Pakistani household. Politics are part and parcel of, doesn't mean they're good politics, but like politics are part and parcel of being a Pakistani, of being raised in a Pakistani household. So I grew up watching Peter Jennings and Barbara Walters, and to me, when I was really young, I looked at them as like these incredible arbiters of not just information, but like moral quandaries and talking about issues in a really interesting and accessible way, and also empathetic, especially Peter Jennings. My memories of him in particular, maybe Barbara Walters, when you look back at her work and some of her interviews, not necessarily very empathetic, but Peter Jennings, I just remember, had such a incredible empathy to his approach to just talking about things, to talking about people, that it was hard not to watch this as a kid, and especially as a kid who was just really interested in things that were happening in the world, in the country. I grew up in the United States and Canada, so it was hard not to be enamored with people who knew how to have conversations with such depth and empathy. And of course, not to take it back to 9/11, but also, post 9/11 is when I, like a lot of other young Muslims in the United States and in Canada, really start to pay attention to narratives, right? Like I'm young. I was 14 years old. I'm watching, and I wore the hijab, and I love my faith. I love my community. And all of a sudden I'm seeing these images and these reports and these narratives and tropes come out about people who look like me and my parents and my brother, and people who believe, so-called like us. And I don't recognize these things that are being said. Like, I'm being told my religion is A, B, C, D, but that's not my experience. And then, of course, like a lot of others, I just kind of delve into studying the religion to be like, is this really what it's all about? But it's the first time that I really felt that I, kind of confronted the media, the news media in particular, as not just something to watch on a Friday night or in passing and what's happening in the world, but really as this arbiter of power and of also life and death in a real material sense. So I was always interested in journalism. I enter college in 2005, and that was a year of the quote unquote Danish cartoon controversy, and also the year of the quote unquote French riots that happened. And watching the way the media is talking about these things, what context is allowed and what context isn't allowed. And so even though I was in college, I was studying Middle East studies and political science, but I had every intention of going to law school. And over the course of my time in college, as I'm going through everything, and I decided to also apply to grad school. And I ended up getting into the Islamic Studies department at McGill, which is where I also did my undergrad. And, that was another incredibly eye-opening, experience for me. I always tell people I had a very, my experience in grad school is very antithetical to probably what most people experience in grad school, because mine was extremely radicalizing in terms of my politics. I did my master's dissertation on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon during the interim Oslo period. So I really was forced to like dive into the occupation, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, displacement. But more than that, I was looking at historical narratives, and so much of my graduate studies was about historiography. It was so much about how do we understand who writes history, right, and how it's written, and sources and everything. And so I'm gaining all these tools, and I'm very, very, plugged into current affairs and the news and whatnot. And as I'm doing this, I'm also kind of like on the side, like writing for the school paper. And then I start writing for, like I wrote a few pieces for The Guardian about, this is around 2011, 2012. So of course you have the Arab Spring. So I'm talking about coverage of Islam and Muslims and Arabs, in the context of all of this. And then in 2014, there's also Twitter, right? This is the era of Twitter, really at its height. We're all connecting on here, being exposed to not just new ideas and new people, but really just new avenues to publish and get our ideas out there. Especially for a lot of us who are coming from communities that don't have those platforms kind of readily available to us. So in 2013, I get a Twitter DM from Imran Garda, who legendary Al Jazeera anchor, someone who I deeply respected. I think he's a fantastic journalist. Reaches out and he's like, "Hey, you're pretty funny. Can we get you like down here in San Francisco? Where we're working on a project. It's called AJ Plus Labs. Everything was called Labs back in the day. AJ Plus Labs, and you're funny. Maybe you could do something like news and satire." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm totally down." I went down for like 2 weeks. It was so chaotic. It was a lot of fun, but it was so chaotic. And I just went there 2 weeks as a contractor, and then like less than a year later, they brought me on as a contractor and then full time. And I, by the way, had a purely like print background, purely print background. I didn't have any video experience. I just got really, really blessed that this was a new project that was being done by a bunch of people at Al Jazeera who were trying to figure it out. I mean, really, like I would say, AJ Plus is this project that we were figuring out as it went along. It wasn't like we knew exactly what we had to do. In so many ways, we stumbled into it, and that's not to at all discount the amazing work that so many people put into it to build it. But in so many ways, it was like, this like. We were testing a lot of things, and seeing and throwing things to the wall, and seeing what stuck. It was, we were a bunch of millennials in San Francisco during the tech boom, and it felt like maybe there was a possibility of a future at that point. Things weren't quite so apocalyptic as they feel now, and so we were able to really, really create something cool. But I didn't have a video background, and I just remember the guy who hired me, his name was Abdullah Musa, and I went up to him and I said, "Look, thanks for hiring me. So, how do I get started?" He's like, "You figure it out." He's like, "You figured this out." He's like, "You're a great writer. Now figure out how to take that and throw it into video." And I was like, "So I was coming from writing thousands of words, and now I was being asked to write a 30-second explainer on like whatever, right? I remember once being asked her, Sana, can you explain ISIS in 30 seconds? And I was like, what? What? But that's what I had to do. So I spent like 12, 15 hours in the office just figuring out how to do my job. And I ended up, being there for 10 years. I was there for 10 years. I went from producer to senior producer. And throughout that, for 9.5 years of my 10 years at AJ Plus, I was also an on-camera presenter, something I never wanted to do. And they were like, hey, can we just throw you on camera and see how this works? And I just kind of snowballed from there. And then in summer of 2024, unfortunately, I was laid off, but I was there, yeah, for 10 years. And I always talk about how my experience with and in journalism was really a lot of blessings and a lot of like opportunities coming my way, that I would just say yes to. I'm like, sure, why not? Let's do it.
It's always interesting to hear perspectives from behind the scenes, as it were, because from the kind of outside looking in, or just from our perspective as viewers, it certainly did not seem like you or anybody else at AJ Plus was, as you put it, figuring it out along the way. It was very polished. And of course, as you said, during that era in the 2010s, it was very, very popular.
It was cool. And what was really cool about the whole thing is that, we really did make a lasting impact on the news industry, right? And we can argue to what extent was it a positive impact as well, because, we were the first ones to natively upload video onto Facebook. That was AJ Plus. We started doing these short explainers. I mean, you also had, of course, Now This was there. They were kind of our direct competitor, and we were like, it's like an arms race, like, between us. But we were figuring this out. And then I believe it was in 2016, at the Online Journalism Awards, which are, the awards that are voted upon by our peers, we were voted alongside the New York Times, unfortunately, but we were voted as kind of like, we were kind of best news organization, but also specifically recognized for pioneering social video, which everyone takes for granted, right? Like social video is all video, but specifically the social news video, that was us, right? That was us, because the philosophy behind AJ Plus was like, we're not going to create a centralized space which the audience goes to. Instead, I mean, we did have like our YouTube page, and we had, but the entire idea was, we're going to be where the audience is. And the young millennial audience, which was, people who were our age that we were trying to get. And then, of course, Gen Z as well, eventually, they're all online, right? They're all on Twitter, they're on Facebook, they're on Instagram. And of course, like, that's where we were catering, is that our news product is going to be in your feeds, as opposed to you coming to find us. And it was very successful. And it's something that all news organizations then jumped on. Now, of course, after, it's been over 10 years since all of that, of course, we've moved on to like back to longer form. And then, it's kind of, I feel like, and streamers, of course, and podcasts, video podcasts and all that. So it's really evolved. But no, it was cool. And it was really cool because, again, I don't want to make it seem like it was haphazard. It wasn't haphazard, right? We had incredibly talented young journalists from around the country, but especially, like, I think being in the Bay Area was really good because we're so removed from the center of power, which is the East Coast, right? We're not near the financial capital, which is New York. We're not near the imperial and political capital, which is Washington, D.C. So we don't have that kind of, I don't want to say the word like desperation, but we don't have that drive to be like, oh, I need my sources here and I need my, this and that in DC or in New York. So we were just kind of all the way out on the West Coast, in San Francisco, able to we were looking eastward. So we're looking across the country and we're looking at stories. We were amongst the first journalists on the ground in Ferguson in 2014. When Michael Brown was killed, we had 3 or 4 of our journalists who caught the story, because a lot of our journalists also came from organizer backgrounds. And they're like, hey, this is starting to happen. We need to get down there, right? Immediately. And we didn't go with big cameras, right? We went with iPhones and gimbals and, basic mics and went there and got that story. We were also, 2014 is the same summer where, prior to the 2023, genocide of the Palestinians, it was the biggest assault on Palestinians by the Israelis in Gaza, which, right, in the summer of 2014. And we were on top of covering that, including talking about media complicity. We were talking about that back in 2014. And it went viral because for so many, especially for young Americans who are news consumers, they hadn't seen anything like that. They really had not been able to see anything in their news media ecosystem that was talking to them directly in a language they understood and talking to them about the world and what was happening in a way that resonated with maybe their sense of justice and morality.
You mentioned earlier that you grew up in a political household and your point of access into journalism was in large part political. That's of course not true of all journalists. Many journalists enter, the kind of their careers or begin their careers seeking to do apolitical work, as it were, in sports journalism or food journalism or, fashion journalism. Of course, all of that is still political in one way or another, but not everybody sees their role as a journalist as being political. So I want to ask you to tell us how your perspective on what journalism is about, what it's for, and what the journalist is. How has that perspective changed for you over the years, beginning with your introduction to, say, Barbara Walters as a young person, and then as a student journalist, and then during your years at AJ, and then post AJ as well?
I mean, for me, journalism when I was younger was always about, like, oh, getting to interview cool people and ask like interesting, tough questions, maybe, or just, just being really inquisitive or talking about the things that are happening in the world and the good things and the bad things. I mean, it's a very kind of simplistic binary approach, which of course is rooted in being like a kid, right? Like that's how, I mean, especially in the 90s, in the early 2000s, especially before 2001, like the way that I'm consuming the news media is not like from the vantage point of someone who has a sense of a politicized identity. Of course, my identity was politicized, but I didn't have that sense of it, right? I'm not coming. I mean, I'm not black, right? So, as a Black American, so I was this like vaguely brown kid in New York growing up, in the 90s. And I didn't really quite fit, but I didn't necessarily have this, again, politicized in my mind, right, as a kid, to have this politicized identity. And of course, like that changes when you become directly the subject of the headlines. And that's the thing, right? It's like I didn't have a choice. And especially, again, being like a 14-year-old girl who's wearing the hijab. And at that point, we'd moved to Canada. So, being a 14-year-old Muslim girl practicing, wearing hijab, that was really thrown on me, this like really politicized identity, because I didn't really have a choice. Because I was put in a position, like so many other young Muslims, where you were defending yourself. But then you're not just defending yourself, you're defending your religion and you're defending your community and your family. And then in order to do that, not only do you have to learn about your religion with such a depth, which might feel bizarre for like a 14, 15-year old to know, but then you also have to learn about geopolitics. Because how am I going to be, for instance, like, when we start talking about the invasion of Afghanistan and then, of course, the invasion of Iraq, like as a 15-year-old, I can't just be like, oh, that's how you feel, right? Especially when you're in this position where there's a politicization that's forced on you and your identity, is that you can't just be like, no, I think war is bad. No, all of a sudden now you need to know the ins and outs of why, like, this administration is lying about weapons of mass destruction, the history of the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Taliban, how did the Taliban even get into power? Like all of these are things that I had to learn. It wasn't enough for me to be anti-war. It wasn't enough for me to be like, hey, hate crimes are bad. We shouldn't do that. I needed to, and I felt like I had to know more. And in a way, it was also because I became like an ambassador. I was an ambassador of my faith and my identity, sometimes quite literally to my own teachers, right? My own teachers, and I love them, and I really, really love the education that they gave me and the training that they gave me, like through middle school and high school. But yes, I was put in a spot where I had to be an ambassador for my faith. And when you're put in that position as a kid, you're like, I can't be ignorant about this because there's too much at stake. If I say the wrong thing, like that can hurt people. Like that's how you're thinking as a kid. Like if I say the wrong thing, they're going to have a bad idea about Muslims and Islam, or they're going to have the wrong idea about it, and that can perpetuate cycles of violence and hurt and so on, or bullying, right? Like, I mean, there was so much bullying happening and so much casual Islamophobia and all that. So for me, it was like journalism at a very young age became a political act because it inherently is a political act, right? For me, journalism has been, continues to be, and will always be, like, if we want to understand it at its core, it's this vessel for accountability. It's about punching up as opposed to punching down. And unfortunately, what has happened over and for a very, very long time, the last couple of decades, as our news media, especially here in the United States, that's usually the vantage point I speak from because that's the industry that I work in and I can speak most, honestly from, is that it's become so corporatized, but also so entrenched in state power that what we see is not a punching up, but a constant punching down. And so for me, there's look, like journalism doesn't pay money. Like it's not you don't become a journalist because you're like, I'm going to make six figures a year and I'm going to have a really nice, comfortable lifestyle and I'm going to, this, that, or the other. A lot of people get into journalism because they have an earnest desire to do good. They really do, right? And sure, there are a lot of people who get into journalism because they want to be on camera. Absolutely. But there are a lot of people who get into journalism because they're great storytellers. They love to tell, interesting stories. They love to talk to people. They have a gift for writing. I mean, all these things, and they have ideas in their heads and they want to share them. And they also, I think if you're coming from communities that are marginalized, there is a desire for you to really push against the narratives that exist about your community, even though not all of us want to be doing that, right? There's so many, for instance, Muslim journalists that I know that just want to talk about like pop culture, right? That just want to talk about food. But, as you mentioned, these are also things that are not apolitical. And to have a very racialized and politicized identity, that can't be separated from the work then that you're doing.
I did want to also ask you about who counts as a journalist for you. When a lot of us think about journalists, we have in mind, I suppose, people like Barbara Walters, people like yourself, people like Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill. These are different people doing different types of things, but they're all journalists in a way. What in your mind makes the journalist? And then also, if I can add a question here, what do we make of these more recent, I don't even know how to characterize them, these figures that are popping up now on YouTube, citizen journalists, as it were. They're not connected to an entity, let alone a corporate entity. I have in mind figures like Tyler Oliveira, maybe even a Nick Fuentes. Are these people journalists in your mind?
I think the category of journalist has become so vast that even I'm like, what is a journalist again? And sometimes even for myself, I feel like I'm like, am I oscillating between being a journalist? Like I think I'm like a journalist in the big J sense in terms of my overall career. But sometimes with the way that things are moving in this industry, you're just like, or am I just like a commentator? Like what am I, right? Which I don't consider myself that way. But just the way that people themselves are starting to engage with these questions. I mean, for me, a journalist is very simple, right? It's someone who is directly relating to and engaging with the things that are happening in our communities and in our world in a way that interrogates these things honestly, fairly, and punches up and not down, right? And someone who is not interested in sensationalism, but someone who rather works within this framework of providing maybe, yeah, a more sober analysis of things or a more sober kind of. Um, Now, that being said, there are a lot of people who would be classified as capital J journalists who absolutely don't fit that, right? Absolutely don't fit that. That's just my interpretation of it because I do think that right now, I mean, there's also my hot take, which would be my unpopular take, which would be my subway take, I guess, would be that all journalism is also propaganda, right? Whenever you're dealing in the trade of information, that is propaganda. And I don't mean propaganda in like a pejorative way. I mean propaganda in terms of you're using propaganda to sell certain ideas. If we understand propaganda in that way, right, that you're trying to sell particular ideas about something, all journalism is ultimately that way. I don't hide the fact that my journalism, right, comes from a very specific political vantage point. That doesn't mean that I'm not open to exploring other ideas or that I can't be wrong. Of course I can be wrong. And I have often been wrong too. But it's rather like I'm very open that yes, my ideas are left leaning, for instance, right? Much more Marxist. I'm, also coming from an Islamic vantage point as well. And so for me, the prism through which I present and explore media narratives and geopolitics and even domestic politics is through the prism of like, I believe in things like universal health care, right? I believe in human dignity, right? I believe in the dignity of human life. These type of things that are my basic principles. I'm, anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist. I'm very anti-fascist. So of course that's a vantage point I'm going to come from. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Because for me, those positions are positions that are still punching up and not down. I think as soon as we start coming from also positions that are punching down, like, where you're being pro-fascist, when you're actually upholding the systems that are oppressing people, then we start moving into more dangerous territory, which is where someone like, like Nick Fuentes, right? We take him as an example because he is very, very popular. I mean, Nick Fuentes, I think, is kind of in his own category too, because he's kind of just like, what's the word? He's a troll, right? He also goes with what's popular. A lot of people online these days really attach themselves to wherever the wind blows, aka wherever they can get the most attention, relevancy, and money. Unfortunately, that's become a huge part of our media ecosystem as well. And I always also say that journalists these days, like capital J journalists, serious journalists, everyone right now is kind of lamenting, oh, like, I can't believe that people are trusting in these, in like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and so on and so forth, not realizing that the reason why people are putting their trust in these individuals who are not associated with any legacy media, which by the way as well, right? Like legacy, what does that even mean in terms of authority anymore? The last 3 years in particular with the genocide in Gaza have shown like how useless, unfortunately, our legacy media is, because it got lockstep with not even just the US government, but with the Israeli military in order to be directly complicit in the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. But, so they look at this and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that people more and more are turning towards here, not realizing the reason why they're turning towards here is because in this country, especially over the last 3 years, there has been not only a moral and political vacuum created, but also an information vacuum. Because our news media, instead of actually saying and reporting things as they need to be reported and talked about, right? Especially when it comes to Gaza, you can't really, if you are a news consumer, if you have social media and you're seeing day in and day out that young children's bodies are being shredded by bombs that are paid by your tax dollars, and you're seeing that live on your news feed on Instagram or Twitter day in and day out, and then your news media, right? Your trusted journalists, whether it's Jake Tapper or it's the New York Times, whoever it is, gets up there and says and justifies it or obfuscates it, right? That's going to create a massive, massive information vacuum. It's going to create trust in U.S. news media, in legacy U.S. news media in 2020 was already at 34%, which was the lowest it had ever been in terms of recorded history on that. So it's only been falling. And so, of course, when this vacuum is created, it allows people then who may be journalists, who may not be journalists. I mean, I think Tucker Carlson is a journalist, right? He may not be everyone's cup of tea. I'm not a huge fan of Tucker Carlson, but I understand the function that he plays, and he is a journalist, are able to then come in and bring people into their own silos as well. So long story short, to answer, your question of like who gets to be a journalist, to be completely honest, I don't know anymore, right? Because at this point, everyone, who has a camera and a mic and can talk to a camera, can call themselves a journalist. I think the actual work of journalism, if we understand it through, again, as a vessel of accountability that is holding the powerful and power itself to account, I think those are far few in between. And that's a dying breed. I think journalism itself is becoming, especially here in the United States, it's becoming a completely different beast that is driven, unfortunately, more by this, profit and a thirst for relevancy and sensationalism all across the political spectrum, as opposed to something that's driven by actual commitment to a certain set of principles and how we talk about the enslaver and the enslaved, so to speak.
So one thing that you brought up was this kind of blurry line that's emerging between the distinction between, on the one hand, mainstream media or establishment media and, emergent media or alternative media. I think, once upon a time, this line might have been a lot clearer where, something like, Alex Jones in the 90s, right? Or, later on, let's say the Young Turks was much more clearly defined as, okay, this is alternative media. This is stuff that maybe might make it onto kind of a local TV station or something, as opposed to now where, is something like the Daily Wire alternative media? When you look at just like follower numbers, funding, views, which kind of might outrank something like from CNN or CBS. And then obviously we have a whole other topic, which we'll get to, and we can talk about Barry Weiss, and you recently wrote an article about this. But how do we distinguish between these things anymore? Does it even make any sense to talk about mainstream media or establishment media versus alternative media?
One of the things that's happened is that, especially on the right, the media ecosystem is so it's quote unquote vast, but it's also very like just connected to each other, right? So even when you look at like podcasts on the left that I follow, a lot of them are in the same ecosystem. They're all feeding off of one another. They're not existing in any siloed sense. And so, sure, like Daily Wire is alternative, but again, the question is alternative to what? If we're just talking about, sure, it's alternative to like legacy news media, right? Daily Wire is alternative to CNN. It's alternative to MS Now. It's alternative to, well, not CBS anymore, but like, to ABC. But is it alternative to the reigning ideology of this country? Not necessarily, right? Even CNN, is that like, I mean, it's not obviously alternative, but that's not really like that alternative to the reigning ideology. I mean, all these things ultimately feed into some facet of the reigning ideology of this country, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. So actual alternative media, so media that is, whether it's individual or it's an actual organization, those are the ones that are more siloed, unfortunately, maybe, or don't have that, of course, same mainstream. I mean, that's why it's alternative. It's out there. It's just it's not going to be as influential. I mean, that kind of makes me think of like someone like Hassan Piker. Can we say that Hassan Piker, like truly, right, is now alternative, when he has been and has himself taken himself directly into one of the vassals of American power, which is the Democratic Party? At what point are you? And I would argue he's not, right? He's not really an alternative, because now when you are part and parcel of like, again, a reigning ideology of this country, and you're not just a part of it in a way that I'm like interrogating it, but actually a part of it in promoting a certain segment of it, then you're no longer alternative. That doesn't mean you don't have alternative ideas, but as a media figure, you're no longer alternative, even if the New York Times says you are.
To play devil's advocate, someone might say, or you could say a believer in changing things from within might say, well, this is how you change institutions. There is no other way for you to, actually affect change, but by becoming so influential that the Democratic Party can no longer ignore you, and then you come in and you bring new ideas and you change things and you discard the old kind of style of, I don't know, Biden and Obama. What would we say to somebody like that?
I would love to see an example of where change from within has happened. Simple as that. When we look at also change that has happened in American laws, it has not happened on the inside. It was always forced from the outside, including the civil rights movement, right? The way that the popular narrative is told is that, oh, people marched peacefully, and then there were a few meetings, with LBJ, and then they're like, you know what, we're going to, pass the Voting Rights Act, and everyone's equal, and we're great. Jim Crow is over, amazing, America saved, beacon of equality and freedom. That's not really the reality, right? When we look at what was happening on the ground, it was violent on the ground. We always hear about the peaceful nonviolent protests. The reason why nonviolent protests existed was because there were also violent protests, right? And so when we look at again and again the moments that have actually forced this country to acquiesce to certain demands made by its public, it's never been because someone from the radical left or, got in and was like, I'm going to pass, it's just going to be me and I'm going to pass this legislation. Everyone's going to agree with me. It's always been through individual groups' efforts from the outside, pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. This idea that we can do change from within is also routinely proven false when we look at how many people who have maybe great ideas, who come from like a radical tradition or come from this organizer background which opposes the two-party system and what it stands for, and the corporate and elites and the billionaires, how as soon as they get in, we see a complete pacification of their language. It always starts with language, and everyone is so quick to dismiss, like, oh no, he or she is just saying that because they gotta make the moves quietly. No, language determines our actions. They determine also the impact of our power. And we notice that. So when people get in, right, the pacification of the language that they're using, which then leads to the pacification of the actions they're willing to undertake. So I don't believe that, change is possible from within. And honestly, whenever people say that, especially in the context of the Democratic Party, I always ask, and I don't mean this to be hyperbolic, I don't mean this to be sensationalist, but really, could we have ever said that about the Nazi Party? That, you know what? If only some good Germans, maybe some good German Jews had gone into the Nazi Party, we could have stopped some of the ugly things that they were doing. No, because that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. We know the Nazis, we know what their ideology was. We also know how systems function. Objectively, everyone knows how a system functions. But all of a sudden, we seem to forget how systems function, how a structure of power functions when it comes to maybe a structure of power we like, that we feel more comfortable with. The Democrats will never be able to shed the fact that they are the party of genocide, specifically the party that helped start and oversee and lied about the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. They funded it. They supported it. And now they barely have any kind of opposition to it, except to maybe throw a bone here and there to a voter base, which actually is far more ahead on this issue than the party itself is. The party ultimately is not answerable to voters, no matter how we still try to talk about, democracy in this country. The party, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, they both answer to their donors. That's who's in charge here. And that's not just AIPAC. That's a lot of other people.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. Who do you think counts as being on the outside? Would someone like Tucker Carlson count as being an outsider? He presents himself certainly as being an outsider. I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm a podcaster. I'm pushing against the current. But of course, he has or had for a while Donald Trump's ear and was, on a first name basis with him, and he would text him and so on. And I do have a follow-up question actually about that when it comes to Palestine, but let's just start there.
I mean, that's a great narrative for, when he runs for 2028. Carlson is not an outsider. The reason why he is able to say and do the things that he says and does and have the access that he has is because he's very much so someone who for a very long time has been part of the right. Now, the thing with the right, unlike, and I mean the right, which includes the Republicans and everyone else who wants to identify the far right, and he's the far right. He's not even just Republican. He's the far right. Which again, what does that even mean these days? What do words mean anymore? But, Carlson has always kind of taken on he was like, I'm a libertarian for a long time. He kinda had that more of a vibe, in the early 2000s. I mean, I remember watching him on Fox News as well when he was young and always wore a bow tie. He always kind of presented himself as like, I'm just asking some questions, right? I'm just, curious. I'm so curious about things." And that's a very cunning way of him perpetuating ideas that are very much so within, again, the ecosystem of the right. There's a reason why you don't see people who are, right-wing politicians really calling out Tucker Carlson in the way they might call out someone on the left or something like that. There's a reason why Tucker Carlson was able to land that interview with Mike Huckabee. And everyone's like, "Oh my God, he really showed him. He showed how crazy Mike Huckabee is, etc." Well, to Mike Huckabee is not crazy, right? Mike Huckabee is saying what he believes religiously, what he believes politically, etc. The reason why he was able to do that is because Mike Huckabee and Tucker Carlson are friends. He's allowed to move in certain ways because at the end of the day, a lot of these people who are on the right, who are in part of the Republican Party, who are part of the structure of power, know that he's still gonna support them. I mean, even look at the way he talks about Israel, right? Yes, he says a lot of things that are absolutely necessary. And it's so sad because you know, the only reason why he's excelling in audience and gaining new audiences is because no one else of that caliber, of that recognition in this country, who's also a white man on top of that, is saying it with that kind of a passion. Even like the Pod Save Bros, right? Like they are still holding back. They still hold back in terms of how much they're willing to. It took them a long time to get there, and not all of them are even there yet. Because of course they have a vested political interest in protecting the Democratic Party. But, they've gone to a point where they're like, okay, genocide, oh, this is bad, this is bad. But even then they kind of hold back, especially when it comes to really criticizing, the party in any meaningful way. Carlson, and I think the right is very good at this, is that they will embrace you, so long as you're not also really challenging the underlying ideology as well, right? So what I mean by that is Carlson criticizes Israel, still affirms its right to exist, still says, I want a prosperous Israel. I want a safe Israel. He still affirms that. He believes in the project of Israel, just not maybe what it's doing right now. He also very rarely, if ever, critiques the United States imperial power. I mean, he doesn't really do that, right? He'll say, like, I don't like us doing this. This is a bad thing our country is doing. Our country is doing some bad things. But he'll never actually get to, like, why is the United States doing these bad things? Right. And is it only like the narrative with Carlson right now is that Israel has kind of sucked us into this, as opposed to the fact that no, the United States, which is the most powerful military in the world, which is the only imperial power, and if we understand imperial power to be, again, like control and influence in global influence and economic influence the United States has, as opposed to that country actually kind of leading the way in a lot, because we know that the genocide would have stopped in the first week with one phone call. We know this, right? There's and people who resigned from the Biden administration, every single one of them, especially those who worked in the State Department, and they will tell you that no, this was very easy, like in terms of easy to end. It didn't have to continue. It was continued because it was part of Biden's ideology and what he believed in. And of course, Blinken and Sullivan and McGurk. And so Carlson doesn't really engage with that. He engages on a very surface level, acceptable within the right critique of Israel, which plays into a very like America first ideas, right? That like, well, why are we destroying our country for another country? That's a very America first idea. There are a lot of Republicans who are completely fine with that. And that's why he's able to do it. Now, on with liberals, you find that it's sometimes a little harder to say that. It's a little harder. And liberals are also very quick to just cast you out if you're not, kowtowing to their idols within their party.
So yeah, I agree. He's an insider. I've always thought that, and I think the narrative that he propagates about himself, and the one that a lot of people are apparently willing to lap up, that he's an outsider, is it's frankly ridiculous. However, I do find it very interesting that he has this allure among a number of people that would consider themselves to be whatever it may be among the left, pro-Palestine, Muslim, And he's able to do that first, of course, because he has this long established record of being a capital J journalist with a huge following, and because he's closer to these centers of power that he critiques. And that's what makes him, oh, what was that phrase? Mehdi Hassan once described himself as an insider outsider. Okay. That's kind of how Tucker Carlson presents himself, I think. He won't deny that he has, never has, as far as I know, denied that he has access to Trump's ear and so forth. But it's precisely because he has that proximity to him that perhaps a lot of people are have a greater interest in what he has to say than, for example, some left-wing journalist on an alternative media podcast or an alternative media platform might. These days in particular, I hear much more about Tucker Carlson from self-proclaimed leftists, Muslims, etc., than I do about, you name it, pretty much anybody else. They're very interested in the fact that Tucker Carlson has taken the position he has on Palestine, and I think it's because they believe the closer people are to these centers of power, and the more they pursue a kind of pro-Palestine line in their writing, in their speaking, the closer we get to our goal, right? That's the sentiment. Let me just stop there and get your perspective on that. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I understand that sentiment, and I can be slightly empathetic to it. I also understand in the context of like that feeling of desperation to be living in a country where, you know, it's like so many people have tried so many things short of a few things, but like have tried so many things to try to stop this genocide and are like, we don't have many friends or any real friends like on the left with power. So someone comes along with access to power who's like, hey, why are we killing a bunch of kids? On all of a sudden, everyone's like, whoa, that's crazy. That's amazing. I mean, of course, same thing happened when Candace Owens, very early in the genocide, right? She was like, hey, and I actually, believe it or not, I do think Candace Owens, of all of them, is probably more, I'm not a fan of Owens, but I think she's much more earnest in her evolution on this than a lot of these other folks, right? That's not me being like, gotta hand it to Candace, but I think that watching her from October 2023 till now, it's been fascinating because she immediately switched up and she was like, wait, no, I don't agree with this. And she was, talking about being a mother and like as a mother seeing dead children had a profound impact on her. But with Carlson, it's funny, like the whole insider outsider term. I mean, there's a better term for that, which is controlled opposition. I mean, that's literally what someone like Carlson is. I do think one of the values that someone like Carlson can play is in really, and again, I'm like, I don't want to overstate how much this is even possible because of, again, what we learn again and again about how this country functions. But it's that someone like Carlson can play this role in severing or creating a sever within the Republican Party over Israel, which we see that, right? Like we saw, I think it was like, what was it? One of those conservative events, a big one. I don't know if it was Talking Points, USA or which one it was, but Glenn Beck, of all people, was like on stage talking about something or the other. And the questions that he was getting were about Israel. Like young Republicans were like, hey, why are we supporting Israel? Like, we want this in our country. We want this. Why are we supporting? So I think there's a value to someone like Tucker perhaps creating, and we see again, right? The polls are showing us that not only are young Democrats, not only have they completely fallen out of love and are, an interest from Israel, but also young Republicans are moving away from Israel. So sure, I think there's like maybe utility in that. My worry is that, and I've talked about this again and again, and I've got a lot of flack for this, which I'm willing to take because I'm like, but it's that my concern is that ultimately it will then be people like Tucker Carlson, right? And Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you want as well, and whoever else kind of falls into that, who will be used to create the narrative on Palestine in this country, as well as what the opposition to Israel looks like. And some people may be completely fine with that, right? And I don't know if I'm being too puritanical or whatnot, but I think there's a danger in that because Carlson packages a lot of his current conversation around Israel and Palestinians and whatnot in his broader ideology, which is a far-right ideology, which is anti-immigration, right? He is, and not anti-immigration like I just want less immigrants in my country. He, for a very long time, had been espousing very white nationalist talking points. And like he was in 2021 and 2022 and 23 and 2023 was espousing ideas about the great replacement theory, right? That the whites are being replaced by, and of course, the way he presents it, like I said, he's very cunning. So he does it in a way that won't at the if you're not aware of what he's doing, it's just going to sound like a guy saying like, "Oh, my country's just changing. I don't like how it's changing." But when you're actually listening to him and you understand the intellectual trajectory he's coming from, you immediately understand that he's talking about, right, the great replacement theory. And he's done entire segments on this. And that's what worries me. And at the same time, I don't blame a lot of people for going towards Carlson because I'm like, yeah, when there has been an information, moral, and political vacuum created in this country, people are going to go where they feel the most heard and where they hear someone who has proximity to power saying what needs to be said. It's sometimes as simple as hearing someone say, that's enough dead children. We need to stop killing children. We need to stop starving Palestinians. What, or, when Carlson is asked, and he's really good at doing this, and I give him credit on this, right? It's like when he's asked about Israel's right to exist, he's like, what does that mean? Like he's not taking the bait. But the reason why he's able to do that is because he's got decades now, right, of a career behind him. Tucker Carlson is a household name. At one point, his show was the most watched show in the country on the most watched network in the country. But also because he has powerful friends. He's not just some dude in his basement like, oh, I'm just like a small bean just doing like this work. No, he's someone who actually has powerful friends. That's why he can say those things. And that's why certain other people can't get on camera and say like, the question of Israel's existence is irrelevant to me. Moving on.
I guess that's the point that I'm trying to get to here, which is you take a look at the narrative on Palestine as it's shifting in this country, and a big part of it is coming from the Tucker Carlsons and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Dan Bilzerians and the Nick Fuentes and all these other people in the country. They're not drawing on leftist histories of Palestine, leftist narratives on Palestine. They're not reading Ilan Pappé. They're not reading Rashid Khalidi. And like
not
you
even
said,
Palestinian histories of Palestine.
Not even that at all. And like you said, a lot of it is also based in a fear that, and actually Tucker Carlson has been very clear about this, if the Palestinians are ethnically cleansed, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to come here, and we don't want them here.
Yeah.
So that informs part of his kind of his politics on this issue. Now, I actually think Carlson is sincere about what he says to a point you made earlier. He went and visited these amputees in Doha, and you could see in his face that this genuinely affected him. So I think he's genuine about it. Candace is genuine about it. And, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all these others are genuine about it. But it's not the Palestinian cause as we know it and as we have grown up to know it. And yet, because they are closer to these centers of power, it's their narrative that has taken hold. And it didn't even need that much time. It was just a few months. They decided to pick it up. And now it got, now it's a mainstream discussion. So I guess my frustration here and my question is, what did all of that work the left put in ultimately amount to if the discourse on Palestine shifted because of like 5, 6, 7, 8 podcasters and right-wing influencers who decided for their own reasons, their own separate reasons, to take up this cause and, launch it, as it were, into the mainstream. And as you said, or at least as you suggested, this is going to be inevitably a huge topic in 2028.
That's a really great way of framing it, because all I can think about, I don't believe in coincidences. And I think the more you read history, and especially coming from a leftist theoretical background, but also a leftist read of history itself, and especially of this country, you learn very quickly that things are not coincidental. It is not a coincidence that the narrative that has come to take hold right now in this country with regards to Palestine, regards to Israel, is not coming from the left, but it's coming from the right, and a very particular type of right, which is very reactionary, which is very anti-immigrant in particular. I don't think that is coincidental. It's not incidental. I think that's by design. I do think that's by design. And it's based on a couple of different things, right? It's like who's allocated power, but also the way our algorithms work. Algorithms are not innocuous. They're not apolitical. They do work in a very specific, and we know like Elon Musk's X is not something that just, the algorithm there and the way that entire platform functions is not simply like, oh, whatever's the most interesting idea will be put forward in your feed. That's not how it works. If you've been on Twitter, on X for more than 5 years, you've seen how drastically it's changed. It's completely changed. And I say this as someone who has had a complicated relationship with that platform, but to the point now, where every time I log on, I mean, I've been posting less because it's like this has become not there's so many bots here. You don't know who you're interacting with, whether or not they're a real person, if they're a bot or someone with a fake identity with, probably an IP address based God knows in what country, just, LARPing as this type of a person or that type of person or whatever. There is such a lack of organic movement, I feel as though, on that platform. So of course it's going to feed into more reactionary ideas, such as, I mean, that's why Carlson and Taylor Green and Owens, Fuentes, Blazarian, all these people are the kings of that platform, right? And then you have something like Instagram, which, Meta itself is just like a bit of a mess in terms of, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on there. But obviously we know that there is a huge suppression of leftists in particular, creators on there. Which there wasn't, I feel like it took them a while to catch up, but in 2023, 2024, we were able to post things and it would get traction and create conversation. And you can see the difference in the way people are talking about things, right? So now you see people, and I want to be careful with this because I don't want to dismiss the actual like capital R racism as a system in this, but you see people are just saying, well, it's just the Jews. It's just the Jews, right? And yes, in terms of there is like you can't have a genocide without talking about racism as a system, which is also another thing that's really frustrating is that unfortunately on the left, we did have, again, the left is really described, it's very ubiquitous, right? And vast and whatnot. But there was a very particular type of language that took over that refused to really acknowledge a lot of realities. The fact that it is an Israeli Jewish population that is directly oppressing and annihilating a primarily Muslim Arab population. The fact that we cannot talk about those things in an open way on our side is a problem. You cannot talk about genocide without talking about the identities that are involved. That is one of the defining attributes of what a genocide is. So if we're talking about genocide and we're refusing to acknowledge that it is a Jewish nation using Jewish symbols, using Jewish mythology, right? To kill Arab Muslim children and slaughter them and call them Amalek, we're already doing a huge disservice to helping people also understand. And there's a way for you to do that without you sounding like, you're from the 1940s, like, oh, all the Jews did this, right? And unfortunately, like that is the narrative that's coming forward. And people are angry, right? Because in this country, I was saying this to a friend, I'm like, over the years, it became harder and harder to convince really well-intentioned, good people that a certain group of people doesn't control the media because all they're seeing without any additional context, without any kind of actual education being done about like, why is it that our news media all of a sudden, quote unquote, right, is like so, is so surrendered to Israel. And there is actually a way to understand this that goes beyond, unfortunately, the narrative that's come to be, which was just the Jews. The Jews just control all our institutions. They control the banks. They control the media. That's all it is. When it's actually like a lot more complicated than that. And at the same time, we can recognize that there is a racial disparity. For instance, that, structural anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian bigotry in this country, which is structural, right? Anti-Semitism is not a structural bigotry. It was a structural bigotry for a very long time in Europe, in the United States. It's no longer that because Jews, and in particular white Jews, have become part of like the white supremacist power structure, right? Are part of the oppressive class of like a lot of groups of people, including and especially Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians. And we saw that, right, over the last 3 years. But because we can't talk about this, because we can't have this conversation, people see things, they feel suffocated, and then all of a sudden now you have, again, especially someone like Blazarian, who I cannot stand, and the way that he's been embraced by people that even I love and respect. And I'm like, this is not it. This is not, like, just saying like it's the Jews does not actually get to the heart of what the issue is. Palestinians themselves in Palestine, in Gaza, won't say it's the Jews, right? And so it's been really unfortunate and angering to see this. And like I said, I don't think it's coincidental. I think it is by design, whether it's algorithmic design or something else, it is by design. And that's the worry for me, because once the door is opened into this particular, you know, arena of understanding, by the way, it's not also pro-Palestine, right? Like, this narrative is not pro-Palestine. It's just anti-Israel with a tinge of maybe anti-Jewishness, or a lot of anti-Jewishness, depending on who you're talking to. But it's not a pro-Palestine. Tucker Carlson is not pro-Palestine, right? Tucker Carlson is not out here being like, I'm with the resistance, right? I'm here and I believe the Palestinians deserve full liberation, a right of return, and this and that. He's not out here saying that, right? His is more of this kind of anti-Israel, like the United States overextending itself. Also, some of that concern is coming from this realist position, kind of like a Mearsheimer position, which is that, hey, instead of focusing and wasting our resources here, we need to be watching out for Chinese expansionism, right? That's kind of Mearsheimer's position, which is like, why are we bothering with Russia? Why are we bothering? Like, we need to be, I mean, he's also on principle, of course, anti-genocide, and he's talked about that. But also, there is, I think, an element of that with someone like Tucker Carlson and others, where they're like, we need to be focusing on fighting our real enemies instead of giving all our money and attention and power, et cetera, to Israel to go kill babies and whatnot. But it is angering because now we have the majority kind of perspective, or the popular perspective on Palestine is one that is being sewn into a also white supremacist anti-immigration narrative. Like, once you get into that arena, that's a funnel into all these other ideas. And that's what's scary. And that's what we need to be, I think, aware of. I'm not saying don't watch or listen to, Tucker Carlson. I watch and listen to Tucker Carlson. I watch Joe Rogan. I watch everything, right? I'll read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, although never pay for that, right? I'll do it because as a journalist, especially, I need to be informed. I need to know what I'm talking about. But we cannot elevate these people to a point of like salvation. Because here's the question. A friend of mine asked this, and it was such a good point. He's like, everyone says we need to support Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, but to what end? What is that support? Is it just watching them and watching their, like, what does that mean, right? Like, when you talk about a politician, you're like, we need to support them. Well, you're talking about votes. You're talking about money. When we say we need to support Carlson, we need to support Owens, Taylor Greene, Blazarian, et cetera, to what end? And that is what's never defined, and that's also worrying.
I think it's never defined, but I think the answer is, at least in my mind, somewhat clear. In my experience, when I've encountered people say we need to support these people, and particularly to someone like Tucker Carlson, I think what they mean is, let's set aside our differences and let him do his thing for now. Because as I said earlier, it takes us closer to where we want to be. We want him to impact his base so that in 2028, we have bipartisan opposition to Israel, which looks like that's coming. I mean, if you just take a look at the most recent polls on this, we're already kind of there. So in my understanding, when they say support, I think it's, at least as I said, in my personal experience, it's people who would otherwise oppose the politics and the intentions and the kind of pursuits of someone like Tucker Carlson, but are willing to say, I am going to sit back and watch this happen regardless.
I have heard that as well. But then my question is, but what does that mean, right? Like, how are you going to, let's say you were like, you know what, I'm not going to support you. What does not supporting him also look like, right? Like, how would you, is Carlson someone who is he actually subservient to you, or is he someone who works, again, like he has power? He's not just some guy who's like, I need your views to be relevant. No, he's relevant whether or not he has the views, right? He's relevant to the right. He's beloved in the right because he's spent years building himself into that ecosystem and that power structure. So even when people are like, oh, he needs our support, I'm like, does he though? Like, he's doing great. We could not exist in his periphery whatsoever, and he would still excel. So even then, like I understand, like I said, I'm empathetic to people who feel that way because I understand, like it is you feel such a level of desperation watching day in and day out what is still happening in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank, and you feel useless and you feel angry. I mean, the rage that has overtaken, I know myself, it's indescribable. I mean, the way I thought about the world prior to October 2023 fundamentally shifted. Fundamentally, everything I believed prior to October 2023 completely changed, right? Where I was like, whatever it takes to stop this, we need to stop this, right? Like that was a perspective. And so I get it. I'm empathetic to it. My worry is that in this, what happens again, as it happens also on the left, unfortunately, is Palestinians become secondary to them, to their existence, to their own existence, to their own lives and to their own deaths. And I do believe that someone like Carlson, especially because I think he's the most powerful and most important of all of these people who is talking about this issue, is that for Carlson, this will ultimately become an issue to run on. As much as he may earnestly feel a certain way, and we see this on the left all the time too, unfortunately, where so many people who spent the last 32, 33 months talking about Palestine in an earnest way. I believe for a lot of them it was earnest because it's hard not to feel something when you're seeing this. All of a sudden, turn all of their attention and efforts into supporting the Democrats and not really asking much in return. And so, that's my concern and my worry is that Palestinians here, I mean, I'm not worried about Palestinians in Palestine. I think they have shown themselves, I don't mean resilient in that romanticized way, but resilient in a real like way in terms of surviving through 8 decades of attempted, of genocide and ethnic cleansing and displacement and all that. They've persisted and they have a very, very strong and clear political project, not just a national identity, but they have a very clear political project. And despite the efforts of Israel and the United States and others to kill their political representatives, especially in Gaza, but they have a very clear political project. And it may have suffered right now, but I think it will be ultimately fine. So I'm not worried about Palestinians in Palestine itself, because I think they will, I believe, be successful in their quest for liberation. But I worry about our narrative here, and especially in organizing, when we're upholding people who are going to try to funnel us into their other ideas. Because you can't, when you like and you support someone, the thing is you can't just like and support just one idea of theirs, right? Like think about people who are critical of AOC. I'll use her example because everyone likes to talk, right? So AOC, she has some good ideas. Then she has a lot of terrible ideas as well. She's terrible on foreign policy. And you see that people will be like, oh, well, I don't like her on foreign policy, but I love her on, on this and this domestic issue. But then people will be like, well, if you're co-signing her on this, you're co-signing her on that too. Right. So we need to also be very, I think, consistent on this. You can't just support Carlson because he's talking and saying some of the things that need to be said on Gaza. We need, because I'm like, if you genuinely support then Tucker Carlson, to me, then support looks like being like, great, now let's talk about your immigration stuff, the way you talk about immigrants, the way you talk about mass migration and brown people. And has he apologized for calling Iraqis monkeys, for instance, and other stuff? Like he has said horrible things over the years. That's part of supporting someone. If you want to bring someone into and you want to actually utilize their power, it means also holding them accountable. And you can hold someone accountable without quote unquote canceling them, because everyone thinks that accountability is just canceling someone. It's like, no, it's like, okay, if this is the fight that you want to be a part of, if you want to really question Israel's preponderance in American culture and politics and all that, then let's talk about also, the other things you're talking about.
The topic of journalism today, I don't think we can kind of address unless we also address the kind of unprecedented number of journalists who've been killed during wartime. There's an unprecedented scale of targeting of journalists. And then contrast this to the kind of relative silence of the global community of journalists. Is this literally just because Palestinian lives don't matter? Palestinian journalists don't count as journalists? How do we explain this?
That's exactly it. All of this comes down to, I don't think you need any kind of, large expose and think pieces and all that about this. It quite literally is that Palestinian, but specifically, right, like also Arab Muslim journalists, because you've had Lebanese journalists killed, you've had Iranian journalists killed. These are people, populations who are deemed subhuman at best, really, not just by our government in this country, but by our news media. A news media that spends decades, not just years, but decades, formulating these populations as inherently prone to violence, as inherently threats, as inherently deserving of like death. And it might be sometimes tragic, but oh my God, maybe they shouldn't have done this and they deserve it, that they're deserving of their death. That's why you don't have this overwhelming outrage. I mean, so many Palestinian journalists, the same journalists, by the way, these news organizations, and this is what really also gets me so much with these news organizations, is that they will use the work of those Palestinian journalists, right? They will use the work. They will not advocate for them. And then they will reap the rewards. They will reap the awards as well, right? Take home all the awards and be like, oh, we won this award. We got this for our coverage of Gaza and this. On whose labor, whose blood was shed for you to get that work? And it's so frustrating and it's devastating because I think Palestinian journalists, like for me, when you asked earlier, right? Riyadh, like who's a journalist? It's the Palestinian journalist who's a journalist. To me, they are the one. I don't mean this again in some romanticized sense. I really mean this. If you look at the core of what journalism should be, to me, the people who are doing the greatest journalism, who have been doing the greatest journalism, have been the Palestinians, because they, whether they were young, whether they were old, they've been veterans in journalism, or they just picked up a camera on October 7th and did the work. They were tasked with something that we've never seen before, which is to document, report, and talk about their own extermination. And I get very emotional talking about this because I think about people like, I think about people like Hussam Shabbat. Sorry guys. I think about Anas al-Sharif. I think about all of these people who day in and day out told us what was happening to them. And from the day that this started, they were treated as liars. They were treated as liars not only by our government, our president, our political parties in this country, but also by our news media. I will never forget the October 31st, 2023 article in The New Yorker by David Kirkpatrick and Adam Rascon called Hamas Propaganda. I will never forget that piece because that piece was talking about how Al Jazeera journalists, including like it talks about Wael Dahdu and their relationship to Hamas and Al Jazeera promoting Hamas and this and that and the other. And it was shocking to see that it was just pure, and they didn't see it that way. Like, and just the mistranslations that were happening. Of course, no mention of the fact that Adam Rascon himself had been like former IDF and also worked in Israel and so on and so forth. And now he's at the New York Times. But like, it is because if 230 or I think it's almost 300 Ukrainian media workers had been killed, there would be riots here, right? If even 10 Ukrainian journalists had been killed by the Russians, right? We'd all be told to wear like Ukrainian flags in our newsrooms and fly and all that. So for me, it is as simple as, unfortunately, our peoples from Iran to Gaza to Lebanon to anywhere are just not seen as worthy of life and not worthy of being believed. And it's so angering as a journalist. And I hate that I have this anger towards my industry, but it's what I have, because up until the last 3 years, as critical as I was of the US news industry, I was like, well, maybe there is a way to rectify some of these things. These are tropes, and tropes can be, they can be changed and this and that. And after the last 3 years, I'm like, it can't be changed. I think that this is a lost project. And I always say that the only thing, like what is to me the most depressing thing is a so-called free press that voluntarily enmeshes itself with the state. And that's what we have in this country. We have this idea of the free press, which sure doesn't have any official, government involvement and whatnot. But that makes it worse, that it voluntarily will enmesh itself with state narratives and state powers, whether it's American state power or Israeli state power. So yeah, it's that simple, is that Palestinian journalists are great to exploit. Their work is great to exploit, but we can't mourn them. And they must always be suspect, whether they're Palestinian or Lebanese or Iranian journalists, as so many have been killed. I mean, and also I just want to point out is that even Americans who've been killed by the Israelis, whether they were in Gaza, whether they're in the West Bank, they're not seen as even worthy of also. And even if they're white, doesn't matter. And if they're Palestinian and American, forget it. They don't even cross the radar. So there is something about, right, being there, but especially being against the project of like the American imperial project in its totality, which includes Israel, that renders people unworthy of life and of unworthy of being believed. And unfortunately, we saw that play out, of course, with the Palestinian journalists.
You talked about romanticization a second ago, and I wanted to ask on kind of the liberal end of the political spectrum, there seems to be a romanticization of journalism as, the embodiment of free speech, perhaps as a civic duty. And on the right, on the other hand, there's this romanticization of free speech as a concept, and perhaps as a right. There's obviously a lot of crossover between these two visions, but how might we kind of break this down maybe a bit more or explore it?
I mean, it's interesting because, yeah, both of those ideas that you've mentioned, they're so heavily romanticized but never actualized. Attacks on free speech come from both. Honestly, they really do come from both ends of the political spectrum. I mean, in terms of even if it's like, a casual criminalization as opposed to legal criminalization of speech, but that's like a bipartisan issue. But of course, the Republicans and the right lead on the repression of speech. They truly lead on that. And then when it comes to journalism, I mean, liberals, they tout the importance of the free press. But again, when we look at liberal news media institutions, what they have done in practice over the last 3 years in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, is show just how completely unfree our press really is. I mean, not only are we completely surrendered to the IDF and the U.S. government as a whole, not necessarily maybe an administration, but as a whole, the U.S. government and military, but also to corporate interests, right? It comes down to so much of like it's like what 4 or 5 companies own all the media. Like it's such the consolidation of media in this country is an affront to real like free press. And that's, when we're talking free press isn't just simply being allowed to go into the Oval Office or into the State Department, and ask questions to the spokesperson, right? Free press is far, my understanding and my belief, right, is that it goes far deeper than that. And we, on both ends of whether it's the right on free speech or it's, and of course, when the right talks about free speech, their idea of free speech, I mean, it's myopic on both ends, right? The right is like, well, my right to say a slur, right? Like that's free speech. It's like my right. Oh, but like you using whatever pronouns you want to use, like, oh my God, that's the most disgusting thing. That should not be allowed. We're done with pronouns. But I should be allowed to use a slur. I should be allowed to use the N word, the R word, or whatever word, right? That's just freedom of speech. Oh, and then of course the press, like, we talk about, we need freedom of press, but the freedom of press seems to only extend to like, to what extent we can critique, let's say the Trump administration when you're not exercising that power to critique the Biden administration, right? Instead, you were carrying water day in and day out with very, very, very little critical pushback against Biden overseeing a genocide. So both of these, the liberals and the right, like both have very myopic ideas of the things that are their sacred cows, ultimately not realizing that they're very similar. They're very similar in this.
So you recently wrote an article entitled Barry Weiss Wins. Can you perhaps walk us through the article and talk about what you address in it?
So it's been really interesting to see how our members, prominent members, especially of the news media, have been reacting to and responding to the, upward failings of Barry Weiss, right? She enters, is put in charge of editorial at CBS, and everyone is mortified. And of course, she goes and guts it. And of course, everything that's been produced out of CBS, especially since she's taken over, has just been awful. You had Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes was just fired. And it was very interesting because he used the word, he called her gutting of 60 Minutes of CBS, a massacre, which I thought was a very interesting. I'm like, oh, so you do have it in your repertoire to use that word. Isn't that interesting? Like, and it's just like, oh, when it comes to our editorial standard, there's a massacre. When it comes to children being slaughtered by the bombs that we paid for, well, it's an incident, right? And that's before Barry Weiss. I'm not even talking about after Barry Weiss. So in the piece, what I talk about is that, here's Larry. I talk about the Ellisons, who he is, Larry Ellison in particular, who he is, his son, David. I talk about why they're doing what they're doing, because a lot of journalists are kind of clutching their pearls about this and being like, oh my God. And yes, the Ellisons are deeply ingratiated with the Republican Party. They're huge donors. They're good friends with the Trump administration, with Trump in particular. And that's, of course, terrifying in and of itself when there's such an ingratiation between like someone who's doing a media takeover and, someone who's the president of a country. But more than that, we know since October 2023 that there has been this push amongst amongst Zionists in this country, and especially Zionist Jewish organizations in this country that have explicitly stated that we are losing the narrative and we need to take it back. And so they were critiquing, right, like TikTok, for instance, which now Oracle, which is Larry Ellison's company, plays a huge role in the operations. It doesn't own it, but it does play a huge role in the operations. What better way to take control of the narrative than to buy the narratives as well? Now, are they going to be really successful in this? I argue no, they're not. But what we are seeing is what is inevitable. Our news industry created the conditions and circumstances that not only create someone like Barry Weiss, because she was at the New York Times, she was being celebrated, she was everywhere. Everyone loved her. Everyone loved her before she was allying herself with the Ellisons, right? Like everyone loved her because she was also, quote unquote, like anti-Trump. For a long time, she was even talking. I remember her going on, I think it was Bill Maher or whatever it was. And I know in her 2019 Vanity Fair profile, she talked about like being anti-Trump and all this and how she wants more Jewish people to be anti-Trump and this and that, et cetera. Because she was positioning herself as this kind of like cool liberal, like the liberal who was like liberal on the things that mattered. But oh my God, when it comes to speech, right? And it comes to wokedom and all that, even though all of that is rooted in her Zionism. When she was at Columbia as a student, she and other students led campaigns against Arab Muslim professors because they accused them of being anti-Israel. So this is something that's always been a part of her ideology. She's been very consistent. Ellison has been very consistent. Ellison, up in 2017, at that point, was like made the largest donation to the Friends of the IDF. Sorry, it was 2017. The largest donation to Friends of IDF at like $16 million. He's consistently said how Israel is necessary, how it's important and a moral duty to support the IDF. These are not people who hide their politics. They're very, very open about it. So, and our news media facilitated all of this. So for them to all of a sudden clutch their pearls and be like, oh my God, how could this happen? It happened because you allowed and created the conditions for it to happen. Yes, Ellison is a billionaire. He's the second richest man in the world. That does not change our media landscape and what was allowed to happen as well. And now we are getting exactly what was manufactured to happen, which is this takeover. And what I argue in the piece is that Barry Weiss does win. She will win. The Ellisons win. But the question is, what does winning in the long term actually mean? The thing is, Weiss and the Ellisons can do whatever they want with CBS, with CNN, and so on and so forth. But the dam is broken. The ideological and the reality dam when it comes to Israel is broken. People can't unwitness having seen slaughtered families. They can't unwitness knowing that their favorite journalists that they were following on Instagram are now dead. They can't unwitness learning that entire families were wiped off of Gaza's registry. They can't unwitness any of that. They can't unwitness seeing their kids or themselves at college and encampments being, having their heads and their skulls smashed by police that were called on them by their campus administration. Those things cannot be unseen, right? We can go hush hush about it. We can stop talking about it, but everyone remembers what they saw and what they heard and what they witnessed. And so no matter what Weiss tries to do, no matter what the Ellisons try to do, it's too late. It's way too late. You cannot make people fall in love with Israel, for instance, or make them believe in Israel or make them become Zionists after you have done what you've done and the Palestinians showed us what you did and are doing.
That's great. I'm going to leave a link to the article in our show notes. Senna, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. If you're hearing this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of our show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.